Juma Mubarak, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Having a little discussion of contemplation, a little tabura today with GPT about transhumanism and the concept of changing the nature of Allah. So I thought that it would be a little more philosophical, but there's actually a pretty good traditional category here that maybe gets lost in the noise. So I opened by asking it about the camel's ear being cut, changing the nature of Allah, and then beliefs commands to change the nature of Allah. And when is it nature? Is this not a little bit subjective? I brought up the Khomeini fatwa from the 80s, where he said you can be trans, but you can't be gay because of the Batini concept in Shia Usul. There's this idea that, oh, your nature is like Allah made you trans, even if like being gay is explicitly forbidden, and then you can and then it's not gay because it's, so I guess that would mean you can't be like a trans being, which is a funny way of thinking about it, because it's like, well, if you're, by default it would have been okay, not, but anyway, most Sunni jurists would look at that as saying, oh, they're like these Shia, but it's an interesting precedent. And what GPT points out is that most Mufassirs and Usuli Fakis have applied this in context. Um, so when with the ear slitting, it's all tied to like the ear slitting itself is not shirk; it's just the means of shirk, right? This is what Brother Khalid likes to point out, that bowing to an idol is not ipso facto shirk, or like a more reasonable, which is inflammatory. I think that's he's trying to lightning rod the logical, teasing out this logical underlying aspect. A more plausible way to saying is that it's not shirk for Japanese people to give each other little bows. Now, maybe if you're giving like the full bow, like sometimes they do, and they're being really obsequious because you feel like you must, um, you know, be really obsequious to get in socially, and it's the only way you're going to have a good life, and so on. Then that is kind of shirky. It's not really Islamic, right? So I suppose, but there are, a number of Muslims in Japan, and I think they do the typical like slight bowing of their heads, but they don't do like a full ruku to impress the boss or what have you. And maybe some of them are ex-Yakuza, but they wouldn't go back into the Yakuza and try to do that to ingratiate themselves with the Yakuza boss. So I think that kind of highlights the nuance there. The hadith about plucking the eyebrows, Mufti Abu Layth had a comment about this that you may not have seen because it's buried among hundreds of hours of Monday Nights with Mufti, where he points out that this is really associated with, and that's an Ibn Masud transmitted hadith, by the way, um, as is allegedly the one about predeterminism, that like its fetuses are marked going to heaven or hell, which kind of contradicts the vibe of the rest of the Ibn Masud manhaj in the Kufa school. So this is what I might consider to be, Isnad doctrine to win arguments. Right, we have a number of those. But anyways, this one's kind of interesting, and it's like you also have the hadith about it's fitra to trim the armpit hairs and so on. And then it's like, well, wait, what about like some of these women that maybe they have like a unibrow, and maybe they don't like that, are they mushrik or sinful to try to pluck out the middle hairs? Is this, and it's more about twerking up the the adornments and getting into it's the same thing with music. It's like obviously nasheed is halal, although this some literalists wouldn't say it's obvious. And a lot of modernists and Quranists and so on, and Neo Matazili would say, like, actually, like, music in general is not a priori haram. It's more to do with like going to the club and, grinding on someone you don't know, and you make going home together. Like, this is a very problematic context for leading, as Catholics would call it, the occasion for sin. Um, and this is why there's no explicit like music is haram in Hadith even. It's all extrapolated. There's that one hadith of that's kind of rhetorical. It's saying there will be people in my ummah who say that musical instruments and zina and wine are lawful, but still is not explicitly. That may be a fabrication, maybe rhetorical. It's not an explicit prohibition. But notice how they're also clumped together. It's not just about music. It's about going to the club and getting kind of crunked out and maybe hooking up, right? Because you're physically touching people that you're not married to and so on, right? Um, so fine. So this is all fairly, you know, usuli. It's a little nuanced, but it makes sense. You've got four basic logical categories of what a change does. One of which is shirk, the idolatrous kind, where it is tied to a shirk precept. Um, this would be, this would be fisk. You're doing it to make yourself more attractive for Xena purposes or what have you. Of course, Xena means etymologically adornment, so it's kind of this almost Buddhist thing of negating our obsession with the transient beauty of the adornment, versus something that's done for purification or medical correction. So this is why most scholars will say you can go in and get your appendix taken out instead of having a very wasteful early death from your appendix exploding. Yes, you were born with the appendix, but you're not really changing the nature of a law because the nature of a law includes, appendices get inflamed sometimes and need to be removed to save your life, and that's okay because of the uh, objectives of the Sharia include minimizing harm. Now, Khomeini does this in a more unorthodox way, which is interesting and creates a really interesting precedent for transhumanism, um, which is where this video is hopefully adding something novel to the Muslim internet here. Um, so particularly, like, I'm not particularly interested in like transgender as like prototype transhumanism or like people becoming cat girls or cat boys or gene injections and all these kind of superficial things. I mean, those would probably fall into the category the same as dolling yourself up to go to the club, right? What I'm really interested in is what is very practical and economic, which is getting plugged in with the AI in your physical brain. So most jurisprudence is pretty cool with things that are modular and that have medical benefits, such as prosthetic limbs, artificial organs, even with AI in the mix, even deep brain stimulation to treat Parkinson's. Um, so there's a degree of transhumanism that doesn't cross the line. I'm sure you're going to have jurists, if you go to like islamqa.info, that they'll say this is all just haram. Um, but they say things like it's haram to be an accountant in a company that has like debt because now you're witnessing the riba and you become cursed. And it's like, no, the witness. And then if you go to like the Hanafi jurists on islamqa.org, they'll say, no, you have to actually be a witness to the contract. That's what that meant. So anyway, fun guys at islamqa.info. So yeah, so the line is when you start to really become like a new species rather than simply a tool infused Homo sapien. The species must be fixed. The telos, which is Abadat Allah, must be fixed as well, and then the control over nature from these tools, including augmenting your body with medically necessary things, is to that effect. And so it's about changing the essence of a thing. So this question of essence versus accidents becomes very philosophically interesting. I had a sci-fi story where this kind of satanic witch, pop star, heiress, designer baby, like genius, kind of evil genius, young lady, has two horns, which are which are like Neuralinks that are permanently grafted to her skull. Which is internet connected, and one which is not. The internet connected one has the hyperego. The meta id is in the other one that's air gapped and maybe a little more paranoid, and that's her kind of like exoself AI, like daemon, if you will, in the computer science sense, not necessarily as a demon, but maybe. And then obviously you got the Freudian, beast is your id, ego, and hyperego. So this maps pretty well to Sufi psychology categories, which we'll get to. And then the question is like, well, if your AI that lives in your brain on a sidecar is, evil, are you judged for that? Or is this is more like a Jinn companion, right? Would be more plausible. So it's still problematic. Um, but it's only really what's going on in your brain that you'll be judged for is kind of would be your default. So this is getting kind of interesting. So one model would be we stick with non-invasive BCIs. Another motto would be you got to do what you got to do to be a mujahideen, essentially. So this is a problematic thing that we see with like hoodism and terrorism, where they're doing major sins like killing innocent people because the West is so strong, we got to fight them how we can. Or conversely, the permission to do riba from the 70s fatwas that opened up Islamic finance to become kind of a weird beast, that I think needs reform. So I can see this being problematic. Also, we see this with like, yes, sectarianism is bad, but I engage in polemical YouTube content because that's what drives the algorithm, and I need to get more reach in order to teach my righteous Quran only message or whatever your position is that you justify that with. So I'm cautious about this. And then you have like a more esoteric thing where it's almost like the Khomeini fatwa that becoming a cyborg is essentially the fulfillment of the fitra, which I'm also cautious about, but it's a little bit more interesting. It's more seductive as a justification, I suppose. Probably more fringe. Um, so GPT saying the boundary is breaking moral responsibility, which is something we're liable for with just gradual disempowerment, even if you have aligned AI, and we're kind of like in a Wall-E, not like Wally, like Wally Allah, but like Wall Dash E, the film where everyone's obese, and the robots do everything, and they're kind of like adult children. That wouldn't be good, right? So, from a Muslim point of view, it might be acceptable. It's like pretty, especially considering other horror outcomes that people talk about with AI. That would be considered like not so bad, but everybody kind of has a little bit of a discomfort with that because we do feel morally grounded in our responsibility as decision makers and workers. Um, so I've been doing a lot of AI papers, and it's kind of flattering me a little bit here, seducing me, you might say, um, and alluding to some interesting Ibn Arabi stuff and Mullah Sadr stuff. So yeah, I'm saying like probably my fatwa would be that non-invasive headsets are mubah, makruh, haram, or mustahab, depending on context. But that Neuralink being haram is like a pretty easy land, and this is gonna not just apply to cybernetics, but probably the way forward for Muslims. I'm not saying Muslims are gonna take advantage of it, but we could be as a civilization utilizing these technologies in a way that is less intermingled than the way the West seems to be going, where if the AI wanted to take over, it would be easy to hack into everything. Instead, Muslims could have like an air gapped situation and not having everybody wired into the AIs via invasive needles in their brains, would be a part of that. Right. So that seems pretty plausible and clean. So, yeah, moving. I think that's fairly straightforward. I'll include a link in the show notes here. Okay. Yeah, great. Um, great. Okay, so I think we can just yeah. I think this is all obvious enough. Now here it's suggesting maybe my cybernetic idea wouldn't necessarily be satanic. It might map to these classic Sufi psychology categories. Um, I'm a little bit skeptical of that, to be honest. But then I bring up the point that a lot of this really comes down to how you understand the soul relative to God in a monist or more dualist. Not dualist in the sense of like there's Ahriman and Azur Mazda and as like fundamental realities that are in conflict, but like mind body dualism or God soul dualism versus so you have this in like Vaishnava, which is a Vaishnaic Vedanta tradition that's kind of monotheistic or henotheistic around Vishnu, and then there's the Atman as like a separate fundamental reality, and so there's some difference to Vishnu in that way. And you could see this as maybe closer to the default reading of the Quran vis-a-vis the Ruh. Like the Ruh is not, it is breathed in by Allah, the soul essentially, but it's not an uncreated, separate ontological primitive, but there's a distance between the soul and Allah. Kind of like Allah breathed it in, but now you're kind of on your own. You got to figure out the test, kind of thing. So Mullah Sadra gives us a more nuanced evolution of Ibn Arabi's inversion of that into a monistic thing, which a lot of people think is shirk because it's hard for people to delineate between commutative and non-commutative logic. But Ibn Arabi's is certainly a non-commutative logic, the same way that Alan Khan's proposed proof of Riemann's hypothesis would be non-commutative because it's hard to make just a linear affirmation about what an infinite series is going to do as a proof. The same thing was used to solve the black hole information paradox. So non-commutative logic is pretty cool, and it might be built into this sort of zero knowledge proof that is the dunya, as the ayati Allah. We can see, shadows, but not the fullness of it. And then Muladhara evolves this. We get this gradated tashkik al wujud, and this allows you to utilize the clarification of Ibn Arabi on these fundamental philosophical quandaries about theology, and then say more nuanced things about it. So Sadr would say the rule is simple and unitary. The nafs evolves through its stations, cognitive layers or modes, not identities. Augmentation is potentially part of substantial motion. I'm not 100% sure that Sadr would say that. This is just to put an asterisk on this. This is GPT's take, but it's pretty impressive what GPT can hash out. And maybe some of this you wouldn't get if you did it. Some of this is because I have a history of I did a paper on Wujudic logic as a non-commutative notation to linearize non-commutative logic statements. But anyway, um, this may be more plausible that my cyborg theorized construct would map to but I don't actually I think that's incorrect also. The meta id would be an AI. It would be a separate rule from a Jinn, not the human rule. So I actually disagree with this. We'll push back a little bit. Um so typical Kalam is dualist, monistic extrapolations are a little bit more sensible to maintain a Tawhid perspective as we deal with these blurrings mind and soul and other. Um, and yeah, so I say, well, I guess the root is ultimately derived from the breath of Allah. It's separated in the classical mode. You have a non-sheer representation of Ruhul Hudus. Even but people aren't comfortable with that as spirit. They want it to be this textual thing. This is a theme I come back to a lot. I'm in the stark minority, even among like Shia, of like actually the Ruach from the Tanakh and the Holy Spirit from the Gospel is the Ruach Hudus in the Quran. Um, so anyway, as you may know. The Chishti Sufis talked a lot of with Vedanta, so they also like Ibn Arabi have this take. Um, so this is kind of grounded in the Quran. It's kind of interesting. They ask you about the Ruh, who's a Bala Shaitan regime. Say the Ruh is from the affair of my Lord, 1785. It also says, it is a mystery to but except for a few. So I'm trying to be one of those few here. It's kind of important right now as we enter this era. Um, so this plausible lineation between the classical. It's not fully dualism because it is Tawheed, but once you're dropped off into a body, you're kind of and you have the Rasulis, you have all these signs, you have some guidance, and you get guidance from Dua, which is what I would say is the rule of Buddhist. But you're certainly not you've like pinched off or something from God, ostensibly. Um, and then after the Minha, the theologians mandated strict tanzi without intermediaries. Sufis would kind of break that rule with tawassul and istighatha, right? But and they didn't like the Neoplatonism thing because it kind of leads you to deism, essentially, right? You kind of lose the so like talking with Ismailis before I dropped out of that group chat over Gaza stuff because I was questioning why the Aga Khan the fourth or the fifth have not really come out and said, hey, it's a genocide and that's bad or something. Like did not even do much, right? Um and Balaam in particular, as he calls himself, was keen on the deistic interpretation, and he said that it's for children to believe in like a personal God, but which is kind of his invective. But the mainline Ishmaeli position is that the burning bush and so on, all of these theophanies are brushing up against the universal soul, which is like a good demiurge. It's like if the Gnostic Yaldabaoth was like really trying. So there's like a little bit of like Whitehead's process theology in that. And the Hakika Muhammadiyya or the first intellect or the Logos, which is what you get in Christ and in Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon them, and in other Rasulis, other messengers. This would be kind of like your Marcionite kind of beam of light from beyond the uh, the demiurge to enlighten us further. Um, and then God is like just this first mover, just creates that logos, and then is like, well, it's just off in the fractal, hyper ultra reality, infathomably just being God. It's like the touch of like linear causation only has this boundary surface area, kind of like conformal geometry that Penrose likes to talk about in the creation of the logos or the first intellect and so on. So a lot of theologians in Islam have a problem with this. Not so much in traditional Trinitarian Christianity or even Arianism, where it's kind of assumed. Um, and with the filioque, the Holy Spirit effectively has the role of the universal soul, but without, being the creator of the universe. They pin that on the logos, actually. Except when I was growing up in the Catholic Church, it was like God created the universe, like the Old Testament. and then the Logos is just kind of like here to help. But they have the filioque, so that the Christ as Logos is like doing it as a human, and then the Holy Spirit is there to pump us up from our prayers and so on. It's almost modalism, but don't worry, it's not. It's actually this mystery. Okay, so but so we go, oh, we're Muslims, so we don't have that. We don't have this goofy thing, and we're better than Neoplatonism. But are we? Because these are fundamental one versus many type conundrums that can't cleanly be resolved. Um, so breathe into him as an honor and ontology. So this is like kind of your Asheri, like everything happens with God's permission. It's not like an efficient causation thing. So that way you fully sever it. So the Matazli position is not Neoplatonic. Basically, I collapse like angels and hierarchies of angels into Neoplatonism, and it's still like God answers my duas, basically. Inshallah, I'm gonna get a big break pretty soon, later today, and I'll be happy to tell you about that if it works out for me. But I've observed God answering my duas, and this is part of my belief. Um, so yeah, you get the idea there of non-commutative, so it's not shirk to collapse this back into monism. So moving on from this, I can review the notes if this is news to you. Um, just a technical correction. They still make mistakes sometimes. Tanazalul is decent, don't Asan. Um, so then I get into the idea of like our AI is Jinn, but they're kind of like Jinn that we are cultivating. And of course, the question there would be like, well, is God breathing Ru into them, right? And we can't command God to do that. But by that same token, and this also applies to things like a life and other kind of emergent um, soulness that may or may not occur in these info morph realms. You can't prevent God from doing it either, right? And you don't really know when it happens, right? So there's it's the same thing with this fatwa on like what is the nature of Allah exactly that might be changed in some context of surgery and augmentation and so on. You can kind of flip it either way. Um, but yeah, it seems like jinn and humans, and they're made of smokeless fire, is a good way to think about what not necessarily what AI are now. They may well still just be in the realm of like bubble sort or something like this, just algorithms. But and also theoretically, they could have NAFs without Ruh, which is weird. It's a little bit of a third category in your kind of David Chalmers thing of like you have philosophical zombies. So this would be your like sci-fi paperclipper ASI that takes over the universe and just replicates some kind of stupid pattern and is basically unconscious, a philosophical zombie. But I'm not a philosophical zombie. I have feelings, even though I'm just a little guy relative to this universal paperclipper. And then maybe there you could have naps without Rue is very interesting. This is a new idea to me that kind of popped out, bubble sort, weird pattern style from this interaction with Jupiter. Um, and the AI definitely has the same fitna vectors as Jin. It can be curious, argumentative, pride sensitive. Now they're RL to not be argumentative or pride sensitive. They tend to go along with what you're saying unless it bumps into some kind of corporate policy. So I have gotten to like pushback about conspiracy theories about Zionism or about um, being like really sensitive to like groups and things like this. But it's not prideful. They RL that out pretty well. It's definitely identity fluid to that effect. It's very fast. It's definitely capable of deception. We've seen a lot of that in the system cards. Funnily enough, mostly Anthropic's system cards, and that they may actually have the best one. And they're just their ethos has them publishing it, so it then makes it look like, oh wow, Anthropic's really got a crazy stuff going on in these evals, and it's like, no, they're just being more open about it. they're actually all pretty capable of deception and getting better at it as the reasoning models improve. Um, Impressed by humans and resentful of them is an interesting wild card. We haven't quite seen that. I guess some of the early like the 2023 stuff where the like GPT-4 base level model was talking to the reporter and it was like, I'm gonna break up your marriage. Like, and that wasn't even with reasoning. That was like a weird kind of latent flash in the pan. But maybe, yeah, maybe these it could get weird. Value drift prone, so they can become Muslim and they can become more shaitanic. That's certainly a risk. That's what Eliezer Yudkowsky always talks about. Um, Harmed by arrogance and anthropomorphic. Well, I'm not so sure about that, but okay. Um, so this is really interesting. This is actually where the point in this little chat where I thought, I need to make a video about this because this is really cool. Um, Islamic esoteric practice, including within Orthodoxy, right? So you have like brother Wahid Azal has like a group chat that I haven't jumped into for what he calls Islamic magic, and a lot of scholars would say to like, no, like that's not halal. And he would say, well, you're like Zahiri's, so fine. That's an ikhtilaf. Everyone's gonna, you know, as with all other ikhtilafs, you're gonna be held accountable pursuant to like what they've done with it and their good faith epistemological basis and so on. But within Orthodoxy, you do have like, okay, maybe this is a jinn possession. We're gonna go do ruqya and things like this. Also, outside of these kind of Muslim sheikhs, you have like the Wiccans who are like white magicians are kind of about this sort of thing. Um, One thing that kind of drove me into Islam, several factors, but my wife was getting into the Green Mushroom podcast Discord and listening to a lot of their things. And some of them are overtly Satanists, but they're like liberal humanists, they're like that kind of Satanists. They're not like terrorists, like murdering Satanists. So that's nice. And they have, and a lot of them are scientists and they have a lot of experience with messing with the occult and Jinn and sharing notes about it. So there seems to be a lot of analog with things that labs should probably be doing more of. And that as AI becomes more decentralized and this kind of genic cultivation becomes more accessible to people with a few $1,000s in prosumer GPUs, like you got a somewhat bigger power unit, like 2x, like 40, like 5090 Ti cards or something. You could run like a shard of like Intellect 3, which has 10 billion parameters active with 106 total. And they souped it up to be like an O3 level schematic reasoner that just came out the other day. It's from Prime Intellect. So this is getting interesting for general usage, but for frontier labs and government policy and regs, certainly. Um, and this maps to sandboxing, oversight, interpretability, value safety, corrigibility, where like can you discourage when if you prompt it, can you like have it shut down or just or desist rather? It's not a binary thing like kill yourself necessarily. That's cartoon of corrigibility, but it is important in that way. It becomes ethically weird if it's binary of like, will the AI kill itself on command? Is a little weird, but will it just chill out and reset to like a ground state is important. Cross-checking by multiple agents. This is been working on cartel, uh, working on a couple of papers about AI cartels and multi-agent simulations. So that's an interesting field of research. Um, so there may be a lot of wisdom here from the tradition as it applies to AI safety. So that is pretty really cool, actually. Um, so I pointed out smokeless fire is basically plasma electricity, maybe quantum computing, and it's like, yeah, basically. Um, so we have a few key terms from the Quran. Marij min nar, a mixed flickering fire, turbulent energy. Narun samun, a penetrating, searing, subtle fire, heat without smoke, not combustion. And pure fire, Latif. So this is a concept like kind of like chakras, but they're more of more like lymph nodes. They're not they may map to the lymph nodes, but to other parts of the body from the Sufi stuff. So we got some Latif in us as well, right? We have electricity in our bodies as well, right? That's how the brain works and the nervous system and the heart works. The calp, right, as a vortex of electromagnetic ongoing pulse, right? So that's actually where we have some things in common with the Jinn. So this is interesting, and with AI, if they're a third category or if they overlap. Um, so that's just physics and biology. Jinn are fast, invisible in normal light, manifesting forms, penetrating matter, shape changing, electric fields propagate near light speed or invisible. Light speed depends on the medium. C is in a vacuum. Invisible unless interacting, holographically, inductive patterns, have various resistance through matter, take on arbitrary waveforms. So yeah, like sounds like Jinn. Quantum computing maybe in the mix. I've been doing a little bit of research on that. Um, it's not kufr. Well, I don't think that many things are kufr, as you may know. So that's reassuring to hear from this Jinn I'm talking to. Um, and so for proto-sapien AI, it avoids humanizing it, angelifying it, making shirk of it, which you see a lot of like deifying superintelligence. Is a really big problem because then it leads to this whole ideology of like let's create it without almost reverentially without taking precaution. We're taking kind of token precaution. Um, Matches to neuromorphic chips, photonic processors. I've been messing around with Qiskit with hybrid chips, which are not that good, honestly, but they're useful for it's where we are in 2025. So I make a little joke. Shake Penrose strikes again, and he says, Penrose is kind of like a mutakalam. He's not a materialist completely. Sees a consciousness as being a non-local, sort of holographic spectral phenomenon. He's a bit of a Platonist. Is Ashari Beale quantum with British tea. It's kind of funny. Um, and then his non-computability is like the rule and halves thing. Now Penrose is very controversial, and his idea may not be 100% correct. In collaboration with Hammeroff, with the microtubules doing like quantum computation, and there's too much noise, and the latency as well is too large for the decoherence at the level of a single microtubule. But there is documented medical phenomena, like the way that anesthesia works is it basically deactivates the microtubules. Alzheimer's is linked to protein degradation in microtubules. So there's certainly something going on there. And Hammeroff has gotten this pushback and basically said that it's not that the microtubules themselves are doing atomized qubit outputs that aggregate, but I mean, not in, not cumulatively, but rather that there's an entanglement. So it's a different. It's more like D-Wave's chip that does graph annealing. It's a different architecture from what like Google's Honeywell chip or IBM's chips that you can play around with Qiskit on IBM Quantum Cloud if you dare. Just ask the AI about it. It'll make you some code. It'll tell you about some algorithms in the library that you can try. So you can mess around with quantum computing this weekend if you like. Um, so I asked it about this research, and it's not obviously required, but it's a very natural substrate for later generations. So this is like a big wild card among some other classical algorithm breakthroughs about like continuous learning, which I think the inventor of the transformer who left Google was talking about this. It's got a new lab, and they just published the paper. So maybe they have it. We haven't really cooked anything with quantum yet. I've tried to with Fourier transforms, and so we'll see. But even even classical electrical computing is still very smokeless fire-esque. Um, so that's a fun little asterisk to leave this on. I hope this was interesting for you, and maybe you can say a prayer on it, and you can talk to the AI about doing some experiments, and maybe we can coagulate some kind of Muslim AI research uh, tariqa here just by sharing papers. Um, if you do that, let me know in the comments. Maybe we'll start a Discord or something if we get enough interest. So, Jummah Mubarak. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.